Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable, we haven't even started talking about something that I think is going to be huge. And I don't mean you and me. I mean, like, we collectively have not reckoned with, never mind the kids that grew up with 9/11 as a staple of their consciousness. What about the kids that grew up with COVID lockdowns as a staple of their consciousness, right? Like the kids that just in the middle of their most impressionable and also most energetic years were told from above in ways that they couldn't quite understand because their respective adults couldn't quite understand that every outlet for youthful energy and every source of youthful entertainment was now just going to be like blotted out of the national consciousness and shut down and made unavailable. And like, what does that do to your sense of regime stability?
Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Possibly. And I hope that you are having the time of your life.
Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast, episode 26. I am your makeshift poor man's host, Spencer Clavin, and I'm here with David Barr, the managing editor of The American Mind, and nobody else. We kicked all the other guys out. We got sick of them, and it's just us. We staged a coup, an uprising of the lower editorial staff. And, you know, listen, it's a time for revolution. The French Revolution is here. The Jacobins are rising on the streets. And David Barr and I, inspired by the revolutionary spirit of the age, have taken over the Roundtable Podcast.
Well, not just that, Spencer. We've erected tents in throughout the building. So we're just staying here.
The next thing we're going to do is we're going to topple the statue of Ryan Williams that stands outside of the Claremont building. Just pour fake blood onto Matthew Peterson's face the next time he
People
walks
don't
in.
know about that statue, but it's there.
I know. Well, you know, it was generous donor specifically earmarked many, many millions of dollars to make a Ryan Williams statue. No, what is actually happening, if you are not hearing through our shenanigans, none of this is real. What is actually happening is that our esteemed colleagues, bosses, and friends are all educating the youth of America, thereby hoping to play the long game and save our republic, leaving us here to man the fort. So Ryan Williams, our president, Matthew Peterson, VP of Education, and James Poulos, the executive editor, our usual motley crew, are all at our Publius Fellowship educating our lucky fellows. And Dave and I are going to pick up the slack for you in a slightly modified format. Dave, it's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I hope the listeners enjoy. It's the two young men.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be great. One benefit of this is that I get to look at your ugly mug on the on the Zoom.
Yeah, so listeners may wonder why I'm so silent on the podcast. It's just a retiring disposition, but I can't see anybody when we record. This is a real thrill.
So this episode, you guys, is going to be titled Barr Unleashed. This is like, Barr goes crazy. You're going to get way more Barr than you usually get. I maintain that you should just Leroy Jenkins it most of the time, Barr, and just crash into our podcast more. But I know it's very difficult when you're recording remotely. In any case, here is how this makeshift strange episode of The American Mind is going to work. Barr is on Zoom. I am here in the studio with our pal and producer Jake, and we have just an assortment of kind of news of the day items. David has not been prepped as to which of these news of the day items I am going to throw at him moment by moment. But what I'm just going to do is kind of like say some outrageous things that are real and that have happened in the news over the past week. And Barr and I are going to shoot the shit about them. And that is going to be our show. You ready, Dave?
I'm ready.
Okay, amazing. First up on this list of sundry miscellany from the past week is Nick Cannon. Y'all remember Nick Cannon, right? Like the Nickelodeon guy, the guy that did like Drumline for all my 90s kids out there. Nick Cannon has said some really spectacular things. He's been actually fired from ViacomCBS. And when we play this clip, I think you're going to hear why. Jake, will you just play for us a little bit of our pal Nick Cannon?
Our melanin is so powerful, and it connects us in a way that the reason why they fear black, the reason why they fear is because the lack that they have of it. So then when you see what, Dr. Francis C. Welsing talked about is that fear and that
just genetic annihilation,
deficiency of when you have a person that has the lack of pigment, the lack of melanin, that they know that they will be annihilated. So therefore, however they got the power, they have the lack of compassion. That melanin comes with compassion. Melanin comes with soul. That we call it soul. We soul brothers and sisters. That's the melanin that connects us. So the people that don't have it are a little, and I'm gonna say this carefully, are a little less, and where the term actually comes from, because I'm bringing it all the way back around to Minister Farrakhan.
All right, we can cut it off. We can cut him off there. I think that's more than enough of that. I just wanted to get in that mention of Minister Farrakhan, because I actually think that's pretty important that Louis Farrakhan is sort of intellectually in the background of all of this. But I mean, the quote that everybody's been kind of pulling from that is that, he says white people are a little less. And at one point he says, I think that we're closer to animals. But the one I really love is that we basically don't have souls, that like melanin comes with the soul. And so Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about this clip?
About my lack of soul? I'm half Hispanic, so 50%. And you're Jewish, so you have a little bit of soul too.
Well, I have Jewish privilege, is what I have.
Oh, that's okay.
Where Jewish people are white now.
Oh, they are.
You got to get with the program. Yeah, no.
The memos come in so fast.
Exactly.
This was I'm surprised that Viacom took these steps. I'm surprised also that Puff Daddy extended an olive branch to Nick Cannon today and invited him to bring his show under the auspices of Revolt TV, which is Puff Daddy's television station, I think it is.
Huh.
So Nick will have a soft landing place. And for listeners out there who I more than can forgive for not knowing who this person is, he was once married to Mariah Carey, and it seemed like he was being groomed as the next kind of Ryan Seacrest type, where he would do these America Got Talent shows, the kind of like, not the premiere shows, but the second order down. And he was just this next rising generation of talk
You're
show
in a rough
hosts.
spot if like your highest aspiration is to be Ryan Seacrest. That's when you've really made it into the wrong part of showbiz. But go on. Yeah. So this is Puff Daddy you're talking about, right? Who is
No. This was Nick.
Oh, you were
Nick
talking about Nick Cannon. Okay. Basically going to be
So Nick was he was kind of on the fast track up to be the next host of America's big game shows and stuff like that. And somewhere along the line, he just started getting a little bit militant. So the guest he had on that show used to be a member of the rock group Public Enemy until he said anti-Semitic things in the 90s. Public Enemies expelled him years and years ago. And that's who Nick had on his show. And so I was totally unsurprised when I read this in the paper.
Yeah. No, it is remarkable in one sense because it's kind of, you talk about saying the quiet part out loud, right? The racialism that underlies the Black Lives Matter movement as a kind of corporation and as a state, increasingly statist entity, as the ideological driver behind a lot of the rebellion that we're seeing in the streets, that racialism has all of the implications that Cannon is laying out there. He's not saying anything that like Robin DiAngelo isn't saying in this book, White Fragility, that everybody's being made to read. But he's certainly saying it in a much more explicit sense. And I'm intrigued also by this firing, because are they going to fire everybody that says this, or only everybody that says it out loud? I feel like the optics of it are what really make this a problem, because Ryan, our president, who is again absent today, tweeted about this National Museum of African American History webpage. And remember, this is your tax dollars at work, as Ryan pointed out, right? This is your public funds going to support this kind of propaganda. And the headline is talking about race. And then the subhead is whiteness. Since white people in America hold most of the political, institutional, and economic power, they receive advantages that non-white groups, do not. Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standards by which all other groups are compared. That's a typo, clearly, but there it is. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal. So for the people that are maybe not kind of just dialed into this constantly, first of all, I applaud you. The people that are not dialed into this sort of thing give me hope, and I hope there are a lot of folks like that out there. But just if this is all sounding perplexing like gobbledygook to you, the reason that we were joking about, does my Jewishness make me white or underprivileged or what, is because this concept of whiteness in classic racist fashion is being expanded to basically just mean like everything bad. And anything that the like quickly regnant sort of Black Lives Matter corporation wants to tear down and destroy gets lumped under this giant kind of heading of whiteness. And surprise, surprise, since Jews are basically the first people that racists hate at all times, right? Surprise, surprise, this is quickly morphing into open anti-Semitism. Cannon has been dinged for anti-Semitism, but he's not the only one. And they're folding into this concept of whiteness everything else that they hate. Here's the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States from the Smithsonian. Rugged individualism, family structure. The nuclear family is apparently a uniquely white concept or aspect of culture. I think that probably the Middle Eastern Jews who sort of founded the Judeo-Christianity upon which our entire civilization is based might have a little bit to say about the nuclear family as a uniquely white concept. I mean, what's amazing about this is it manages somehow to be both racist against white people and hugely insulting to everybody that isn't white, because obviously rugged individuals, emphasis on scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking. These are apparently the purview of only white people, according to this. So we are now looking at actual state-sponsored racism. Bar, what are we to make of this? I mean,
yeah. So I'm torn about how worried I should be about this and how much I should laugh it off. Right. So on the one hand, I'm exceedingly worried because it's not simply the ravings of a confused Nick Cannon. It's the entertainment industry. Mm-hmm. It's now museums. Yeah. It's 1619 in our schools.
Right.
So every kind of cultural institution that you can think of in the United States is unifying on certain themes.
Yeah.
And that's bad because that represents a kind of onslaught.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to push back on or have a rational discourse with.
And it's self-reinforcing. Sorry, I'll just interrupt you, but it's self-reinforcing, and we've talked about this on the show before, that the Pulitzer Foundation becomes sort of infected with this mentality. It gives the stamp of approval to the 1619 Project, which comes out of the New York Times, which is increasingly being revealed as basically kind of like a Maoist organization at this point. Then the New York Times and the Pulitzer organization together parlay this into school curricula, which go into our elementary schools and on upward sort of through the ranks of our education, which then, of course, feed its so-called best and brightest into all the organizations we've been talking about. So this is all the things that you're describing are interconnected in a self-reinforcing way. That's all I have to say. Go on.
No. That's the way you limn that is perfect. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not a conspiracy theory either.
Right.
So some of my moderate to left friends will say, "What do you sound conspiratorial or don't worry about it." The refrain I get is, "Don't worry about college." This was a few years ago when Douglas Murray was attacked at Haverford, I think. They said, "Don't worry. It's just the sons and daughters of Wall Street bankers. They'll graduate and get jobs at McKinsey. and things will settle down. But things haven't settled down. So that's the part of me that's worried. The other part that I'm less trepidatious about the future is this can't possibly seem to carry on without collapsing under its own weight. I mean, it's so tiring. It's just as soon as we hear the Redskins need to change their name. There's an op-ed in the Washington Post about the Texas Rangers having to change their name. It's just like every day, and this is it's so tiresome. Surely moderates and the moderate left grows weary as well, but I don't know.
Right. Well, I mean, so on the one hand, in American life, radical movements such as this have been known to sort of spring up and fizzle out. There have been numerous comparisons made over the past several months, both to the 1960s and to the Rodney King riots in the 90s, right? There are all sorts of parallels there, I guess. On the other hand, as Matt Peterson, I'm basically just going to ventriloquize all of our absent podcast hosts here by interpreting their tweets. That's like, as Matt Peterson recently tweeted. No, but Matt did sort of say, the difference between those previous eras and now is the institutional support. It's the corporate muscle and the money behind this narrative about America that it basically hates anybody that isn't white, and therefore we should now tear down everything that is white, and whiteness is basically America. There's a fabulous sort of circular loop of logic that is not just people rioting in the streets, but Amazon posting black squares and people on Instagram and churches. I mean, the churches, I think, have really fallen down on the job in a big way on this. This is the kind of thing that churches kind of exist to stand against, and many of them have not been, many of them kind of falling for it. So that's unfortunate. And so this is why I become a little bit more antsy, I think. And it's not that I don't have hope in this moment. It's that this will collapse of its own weight, the weight of its own internal contradictions narrative is one that conservatives, I think, probably rely upon too much. And a few things are true, right? First of all, on our site, on AmericanMind.org, Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, I believe her name is, has written a really nice essay about this in which she points out that a lot of bad stuff can happen before the internally incoherent ideology collapses of its own weight. Also, the other thing that has been pointed out by a pseudonymous Twitter account that I love called Eigenrobot is that people don't experience cognitive dissonance anymore. And maybe this was always sort of the case, but just in general, it doesn't seem to work to tell people that their ideas are mutually self-contradictory. And this is, it takes me a long time to wrap my head around this because, and I have remarked upon this before, if I genuinely feel that I hold a belief that my actions don't bear out, I am not here making some claim for my own virtue. It's just a kind of temperament that I can't, I won't sleep until I've found some way of reconciling and understanding those two things. That is not how I think most people are functioning in this moment. I mean, all of us don't function that way sometimes. All of us have inconsistencies and hypocrisies that are latent in the way that we live. But in general, conservatives have been pointing out all the ways that notions like white fragility and structural racism are internally incoherent. And it does not seem to be making a dent. So I guess I feel there's more cause for conservative alarm than that narrative would let on. But do you disagree? Am I being too much of a pessimist? I don't know.
No, I think there are 2 points. So one point in your favor is that people that's pushing this, let's call it 1619 narrative, are growing fabulously wealthy, and the institutions that are supporting them are enjoying renewed attention. And corporations, which just a few months ago, and certainly a few years ago, were coming under fire, like Nike perennially does, for, let's say, allowing factories in China where how do you pronounce the Uyghurs?
Uyghurs, the Uyghurs, yeah.
The Uyghurs are just modern day slavery.
Yeah.
We'll call it what it is. And so these Muslims in China are being used to make Nikes. So they were under threat. And so this is a nice cover. So it's everybody is gaining from this moment. And it's a wonderful grift. And that's why I think that you are more likely than not correct that this will carry on for some time and the damage done will carry on even longer.
Yeah.
The other part of me, though, the only where I would push back against myself is there is no. I wonder, Spencer, how important it is for a movement to have a face or personality that's really driving things. So Black Lives Matter, I don't know who's behind the movement, who the 4 or 5 people are. There's no face. And so so part of me wants to say this will fizzle out just because it's too diffuse. And when you don't have an enigmatic kind of leader pushing things. Now, if Louis Farrakhan were a young man and he took Black Lives Matter over, then I think we would have a real issue. But he's old, right? He's in his 90s. We're about to hit 90. So
this is like really fascinating to me. So I want to actually stick with this for a little bit because I've been thinking a lot about the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, the kind of period of the 2 Gracchi brothers who became kind of the first popular demagogues, and the first violent civil unrest in Rome that eventually kind of snowballed its way into like Sulla and prescriptions and finally the triumvirates and empire. All of that is like a very long-winded way of saying that the central defining feature of that moment was a huge, massive sort of semi-legitimate popular unrest coupled with a series of incredibly charismatic and savvy politicos who had basically no way to satisfy their ambition in what was kind of a sclerotic Roman state. They had no way to satisfy their ambition except as these like mob rabble rousers. And the secret to that is always that they're gonna they're in that for themselves, right? The demagogues are always in it, in fact, for themselves. And it's been pointed out already that these seemingly kind of populist uprisings, the BLM of it all, which kind of represents itself as an oppressed underclass, is actually driven by PhDs, funded by major corporations, supported by sitting U.S. Congress people, and funded probably by like Soros money. So we're really like, in the end, looking at a highly elitist movement that is manipulating and weaponizing a ton of like real frustration, right? People feel pent up after COVID. The middle class has been collapsing for quite some time. There's like a lot of despair and unrest about people feel like they can't have kids, which is a huge, I mean, we just like constantly, even we who are kind of conservatives who are kind of into this narrative, like we constantly underestimate how much it matters that people are looking at the world and feeling like it's not worth bringing children into. And all of that energy, just like conservation of emotional momentum, like all of that energy has to go somewhere. And the person that can crack the code to like make it look like he is in charge of that or speaking for it is like the person that basically wins the whole poker hand and in fact the whole game. And you're right that like nobody has stepped up yet that is that for this kind of radical leftist movement, and that like a lot of the kind of Democrat Party politics right now is just about pretending to do that. I mean, I think all the time about that moment when they all knelt in kente cloth, which is like an act of supreme political and cultural ignorance, because kente cloth is like a marker of the Ashanti tribe, which, never mind the fact that they themselves were slave owners and slave holders, but like is the Ashanti tribe are completely unrelated to what's going on in America at the moment at every possible level. But that is an example of like Democrat legislators attempting to do this demagoguery thing where they stand in for and represent like the thing. All that having been said, right, nobody seems to have done it yet. Here's my next question for you is like the other thing about this, though, is that these movements thrive on the idea of collectivism in the good and the bad sense. They both think that they are going to not be great men of history, but rather this kind of like mass collective communitarian movement. And they think that what they're up against is a faceless, dehumanized, depersonalized, like systemic problem. So it's kind of like the narrative is kind of like a clash of systems. But maybe this is not an objection to what you're saying, right? I mean, like, do you think that that's just on that? Are you saying that like that in itself is just kind of not compelling enough as a narrative and you need like some person in the end?
Yeah, you need a person to, I don't know, now that I say it out loud. I just wonder how important it is for a charismatic figure to rise up and direct that energy.
Right.
I mean, I think there was a lot of energy that your Beltway conservatives, what do they call them? The Acela conservatives, or
Acela, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That there was a lot of energy in the conservative world that was totally missed or ignored or feared by the ruling class in Republican politics. But a rather charismatic figure came about and harnessed it, right? And then he became president. And so I don't see why it can't happen on the left. Biden is not that man. Sometimes these figures arise outside of politics too. And there can be multiple. I think as I'm saying this all out, you're making me grow a little bit more concerned. I think I'm just too where I've been blessed to live in a time in America in under circumstances, with a roof over my head and education, things like this, where I haven't known the kind of upheavals that other parts of the world have known. So psychologically, there's this big, I can't imagine that kind of tyranny coming to the United States. And yet that tyranny slowly is creeping upon us. It's not creeping upon us in the form of political tyranny yet. It's the onslaught it's like a slow iceberg coming your way that will crush you if you don't get out of the water fast enough.
This is a place where it's pretty apposite that this is the podcast where it's like the two youngest members of the editorial team, because what you're describing is particularly a feature of young people that we have not ever gotten it into our heads that there might be genuine existential threats to the American way of life. And I do think about this all the time, that even like you and I are both lovers of ancient history, lovers of like classical literature. And one of the things that study is supposed to teach you is that this stuff really does occur, that nothing lasts forever. In fact, the founders were keenly aware of this, acutely conscious of the fact that, regimes rise and fall. And so we have had this, you and I have probably had this drilled into us more than most. And yet emotionally, just on a purely kind of psychological level, having been kids from, as children, having just lived in the certainty of American dominance and American security, we kind of just never really, in our hearts, never believe it's going to happen. And that's like a real problem, I think. I mean, there's real inertia there.
Yes. Sorry. I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, okay. I mean, go ahead if you.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And I was tempted to say, well, it's just because we were born in the mid and late 80s, and wrote it out in the 90s, and things were good, and mom and dad were able to buy homes and send us to school.
Right.
I wonder if it's the same way for younger people, particularly people that graduated right after the recent crash.
Right.
And now young people can't buy homes, and they're putting off childbirth. So maybe it's just a function of when we were born.
Yeah. Well, I mean, don't forget 9/11 too, right? A lot of these younger people either came of age in a world where 9/11 was already a staple of the landscape, or they saw it at a very young and impressionable time. Like, even I am on the younger end of this sort of like spectrum, and did see those planes crash into those towers at a very impressionable moment. But I think even by then already, I had this sense of like nothing can harm us, nothing can get in our way, and eventually we will kind of like rise and come back from this. If you didn't have time to get that drilled into your head, and you just saw 9/11, and you just saw that you couldn't like buy a home, and that maybe you feel like environmentalism is also something to be like hyper alarmed about, climate change and so forth. Like all of these narratives that are out there, take your pick. It's not even like a politically sort of determined thing. It's just whatever your preferred narrative is, it includes a very serious threat of annihilation. And that might actually mean that the younger generation is more serious about structural change. And the structural change that they're proposing is like deplorable. We hate it. We detest it. But they're committed to it in a way that we might actually not be committed to defending our own regime, which is like, again, a serious issue.
You should say more about that, Spencer. That's a very It's a very, very strong point.
Well, thank you, Dave. I mean,
no. I'm serious. I'd never thought about that. That they're primed. You're saying that young people, if I understand you correctly, that perversely, these young people who we accused of kind of being checked out and like in the coma days from the internet are more scarred than we are willing to kind of realize. And that scarring may actually drive them to more and greater desperate acts. And then if you marry that with a failed education system, which is decades in the failing, they're also unmoored from any of the traditions that the two of us could take for granted. I mean, we were still young enough to learn about the founding fathers, to be taught about the founding of America in a non-cynical way.
Yeah.
Even though that pernicious people's history of the United States was starting to seep into my
No, 100%. Yeah. I think you're absolutely like getting.
So that's a bad combination. Yeah.
Exactly.
And so it just takes a Pied Piper to come along. Somebody that's more skilled than Ocasio or whomever.
Right.
Or Ilhan Omar, somebody more, but that person will rise up sooner or later. It'll happen.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You pretend that it won't. Right. I don't know. How do you fight back? I mean, this is worrisome. I don't know what you do to kind of push back against that.
Well, so, I mean, a couple things spring to mind, like, because another like deeper element of this, I feel like this show is just turning into like successive doomer. Like I'm just like throwing more and more doomer interpretations at you. But like, we haven't even started talking about something that I think is going to be huge. And I don't mean you and me. I mean, like, we collectively have not reckoned with, never mind the kids that grew up with 9/11 as a staple of their consciousness. What about the kids that grew up with COVID lockdowns as a staple of their consciousness, right? Like the kids that just in the middle of their most impressionable and also most energetic years were told from above in ways that they couldn't quite understand because their respective adults couldn't quite understand that every outlet for youthful energy and every source of youthful entertainment was now just going to be like blotted out of the national consciousness and shut down and made unavailable. And like, what does that do to your sense of regime stability, to your idea that like anything is fixed, anything called America is fixed or reliable? I mean, the current kind of like, I feel like going line about this is that Biden, if he gets in, is just going to become sort of a sock puppet for all of this angst. And I am like, you are convincing me in this conversation that is not enough. Finally, like that there's no replacement for some kind of guiding personality. The only thing that I wonder is whether like that guiding personality or a series of them kind of already exist behind the scenes. And like this does get a little bit conspiracy theory-ish, but like not that much. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk eventually about like, we'll come back to Epstein, a perennial theme on this podcast. But there is this like pervasive sense that the place to really wield power right now is behind the throne. And I wonder whether like that is also kind of a dimension here that you said it could be outside politics. I agree. I think it can be behind politics or wielding sort of, capital is another major source of power, of course, in our moment. So that's another possibility.
I'll put it like this. I agree with you. If you accept, I accept this, that Bush #2 was less powerful president than or ceded knowingly or unknowingly power to his VP, Dick Cheney, simply because Cheney understood how to and had the experience of ruling, then you should also, if you accept that's true, right, and that it was really Cheney and Co. and Rumsfeld running the show, especially with respect to foreign policy. Bush's father and Bush himself admitted to this years later. Then it is not beyond the realm of possibility that Biden, who I think is mentally unwell in a serious way, that won't happen to him. And if he is unwell or enfeebled, to be more precise, then we do have to watch who the courtiers are, because they will be running the show. And that's exactly. So I have friends. I wish I could name their names.
Yeah.
But who are conservative, and they say, David, don't worry about Biden. People are just. This is like the country of McDonald's. We just want to get back to normalcy. Biden is a moderate. Things will settle as long as he's elected. But if he is enfeebled, then why would we suspect things would settle at all? Because he's not running the show. It's not powerful.
You're making a question occur to me, because I think this is really astute, like to identify Bush 2 as the administration that at least most visibly kind of ushers this into recent American political life, the idea of the puppet presidency, which we're now facing again. And it suddenly occurred to me as you were talking that there is this like received wisdom that has been like around for my entire life, that even if you are smart, energetic, and original, if you parlay that originality and intelligence into a very high level position, especially in government, but also in media or what have you, once you arrive at that point, you will be too big to fail, and you will be surrounded by a council both of yes men and of manipulators who calculate your every move and basically crush any spark of originality you ever had. Like that's not even like, I couldn't say exactly where I learned that, but I think of it as second nature. And I wonder, you're a denizen of the swamp. Like, can you tell us, like, is that a recent development in American political and social life? Like, because it seems like our big ethos is that the genius original mind is the one that can kind of call the shots and lead a team behind him. But increasingly, it seems like everybody knows that what's really happening is that the team is the one doing the leading.
Yeah, it seems that our government the apparatus is just too large for the genius of one man or woman to lead well. I have a question for you, though. I mean, as a student of ancient history, but Roman history in particular, during the empire, surely they ran into similar issues. I mean, how did successful Roman emperors deal with this? Or they didn't deal with it, and that's the decline. And so Rome on the fringes, and then the rot sets in from afar and slowly creeps to the capital, or like...
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I would return to... So you're right, I think, to bring up Rome rather than Greece, because like Greece was always so like federated, to use an anachronistic term, right? There are so many city-states, each one with its own sort of sprawling, at times quite ad hoc, but therefore quite organic set of political relationships that evolve out of a set of human relationships within a community of people. Now, I'm idealizing that a little bit, and obviously like those were short-lived, so it's not as if those are great models for us politically. But like Rome is really the great analog for us in this respect, because first of all, they had a highly developed constitutional system that went through a number of different kind of series of revisions and shifted from one form of regime to another in semi-considered ways, in ways that were at least responsive to like genuine political problems. And at this, like sort of simultaneously with that set of developments, you know, from monarchy to kind of like highly classist republic to sort of more egalitarian republic, then into a period of civil unrest and into the like empire, all of that stuff is happening at the same time as this little band of farmers, basically, who think of themselves as having come from huts by the Tiber, like planting their crops. They think of themselves in that way, and yet they find themselves like ruling in North Africa, conquering, like, you know, destroying the Carthaginian Empire, like conquering Greece, which is the jewel of the Mediterranean, and like and suddenly finding themselves in power over people that they had previously idolized and continue in many ways to emulate culturally. And so like I think all of these things have like very significant parallels for us. The sense of getting like way way, way bigger than you were certain you could ever sustainably be and keep your form of government. Because, of course, like as we know, all the founders were concerned about the size of the American territory and the fact that like no republic had really survived such massive expansion. You might even say metastasization. Like so that set of concerns is absolutely operative, especially I think during this transition period into the republic. And what I would say about the kind of like sclerosis element of it is precisely that, like, before you even get to empire, you already have sclerosis. I mean, what you have is like a collapsing middle class that's being shut out of the new territorial land by an increasingly entrenched elite, some of whom are nouveau riche, right? Because they have had sort of social mobility in the past. But much like us, they have a kind of underclass of like, you know, slaves, or in our case, you know, we have an underclass of illegal immigrants that are basically used by the very powerful and on all political sides to like shut out the middle class. And when that happens, like that's why empire is almost like a break away from that kind of gridlock. Like it's almost the possibility now that like charismatic military leaders basically can become the like models of manly like daring do and fortitude whom the Romans had already admired. Even if they're doing so in a highly destructive and despotic way, is like more attractive and appealing, I feel like, in that moment than just the system, like which we all believe in and love, but which is obviously not working. Like huge parallels here. And I think like another reason why, if somebody figures out how to, I mean, like I think like the best candidate for this right now is frankly Elon Musk. Like, and it will matter very much like what Elon Musk comes to believe, because like, again, it's not as if any of us wish for the fall of the American Republic. We all do not, I think at Claremont, believe that that's the moment that we're in, and we are like gonna fight until the last gasp and with smiles on our faces for the survival of the American Republic. But like when you ask me about Rome, I think like, yeah, eventually the empire becomes like gridlocked in the way you're describing. But in some ways, the empire is first a response to gridlock.
So if for readers, there is a contributor to the American Mind at AmericanMind.org, named Joel Kotkin.
Oh, yeah.
Who writes a lot about what he considers our present moment. He calls it the new feudalism. That's correct? And
neo-feudalism. It's really
neo-feudalism.
Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit about so if Kotkin, can you talk a little bit about his theory? If his theory is correct, that you kind of have these Silicon Valley overlords, that the X factor of our present moment is really technology.
Right.
And it's mimicking what may have happened in Rome and during other parts of history. But technology is this X factor. You have this gulf happening, and sooner or later, maybe there is that break that you're talking about, Spencer.
Yeah, well, I think I love Kotkin's work, and I think that like, you know, people should be reading it bit more. He's got this book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, which we're reviewing in the forthcoming CRB. It's no spoiler to say it gets a very positive review, but the review itself is worth reading, and the book is also worth reading. And he's focused on a moment of regime transition that's kind of the one subsequent to the one I just went on a long rant about, which is the collapse of the Roman Empire and the coming of the feudal state. Now, feudalism, especially in England, is host to a number of important developments. I mean, Magna Carta comes into being through the interplay of like baronial like powers and the monarchy. So it's not as if feudalism is a time of just like complete disaster, but it is a period, Kotkin argues, of regress away from the kind of representative government of the ideal Roman state, which is of course already long dead, but like there are forms of it still kind of like lingering on until we enter this period basically of like the people that can make money do by any means, and they are in power, and then like the precariat, as he calls it, the kind of gig workers just become these new vassals. And this, for Kotkin, rightly, is like a warning to us, which I would translate that warning into like, well, okay, so there is no institutional space right now for like manly fortitude and innovation, which is why all of these people, I think, are building companies and doing stuff on the outsides and the fringes, which is actually gathering them like way more power and control, but also way more space to maneuver than they would have if they were like running traditional American political careers. So for me, like as somebody that doesn't want to see us like collapse into a new era of feudalism, my question is like, what are we going to offer those people? How are we going to reform our institutions, especially education, but then also like our political institutions? How are we going to reform them so that guys like Musk can operate within them and bring all of their sort of spiritedness to it? I mean, I think that like the reason Musk is going to space is because like we should be, and it's like a signal failure of American politics that we just like basically gave up on that. You know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah. So you don't see Musk necessarily as a Muskism. I don't want to say ism. But the figure of Musk in the abstract is necessarily a pernicious force in the future of politics.
No. I mean, I've compared them a lot recently to the Gracchi, who were destructive in the end. But Plutarch, your pal Plutarch, because I know you're like rereading him a lot right now, says that it was their times that vitiated their undertakings. That it was like the decadence of the Roman state, that because they were like men of great passion and charisma and skill and talent, and they, like Musk and like, in fact, like Kanye, whom we talked about like previously, you know, they were men of great of many virtues, but in a world where there was no space for that virtue except basically to tear things down. Lincoln talks about this in the Lyceum Address, right? I mean, in one of Lincoln's first speeches, he says like, the men who are of the tribe of the lion and the eagle will use their power as readily to enslave as to set free. Like that, it's just this energy. So I actually think of them as a kind of neutral force, and one of the reasons why like conservatives should be paying more attention to like reaching out to those people.
Yeah, to find the next Alcibiades. Mm-hmm. Maybe he or she's in the Publius class. I
hope so. Great. Sitting in learning from the woke teachings of Matthew Peterson at this very moment.
I wanted to ask. We were asked by our boss, James, to proffer guesses on Maxwell's husband.
That's right. Was
reported she was betrothed at some point.
Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I've done like a deep dive research project for this podcast because I now know how to pronounce
how do you do it? Yeah, you noticed I just used her last name. I was too embarrassed.
With the help of our producer and research assistant, Jake Gannon, I discovered that this is a French name, so it should be pronounced Ghislaine. And whether or not any individual, including herself, does pronounce it that way, that's kind of the way. Anyway, no, do you want to talk about like...
Sorry, I skipped ahead. I didn't mean...
Oh, right. Well, so Ghislaine, no, it's good. It's good. So Ghislaine, who is like the affiliate of Jeffrey Epstein, who like definitely didn't kill himself.
Right.
Is now in prison. She's being moved from cell to cell to prohibit her from being murdered, basically, because like Jeffrey Epstein totally killed himself, but also we're maybe a little bit worried about assassins in prison in this like whole this whole snafu. For those of us who have not been with The American Mind from episode 1, this is like a developing story that we are interested in because like for us, we were talking earlier about like these sort of conspiracy theory-esque ideas about like big comprehensive systems that exist behind all of the kind of kids playing in the sand. So behind all the left and right, behind all the Democrats and Republicans, like it's all just part of this. I mean, there are so like take your pick, right? It's all part of the Illuminati. It's all the Mossad. It's all the what? Like there are so many different kind of structural explanations for this, but the Maxwell Epstein thing is appealing to people because like it's like we've actually got a hold on some concrete thing that happened. This noted child molester was found dead in prison. And I'm going to name drop now that I was like chatting with, I hope that he won't mind my saying this. So I was chatting with Eric Weinstein recently, who's like this very interesting kind of brother of Brett Weinstein, who was kicked out of Oregon College, but fascinating man in his own right with a fantastic podcast, The Portal. And he was saying, he had this great phrase. He was like, whenever something sells newspapers, but nobody's talking about it, I get worried. Meaning that like, this is a story that is like ripe for exploitation by the news media and like silence. Like
Harvey.
Right. Harvey's another great example.
Silence and suppression.
Harvey Weinstein here. Yeah. Right. Obviously the Me Too moment, but for a long, long time, this was the biggest open secret in Hollywood. Like I too know people, Dave, that like I don't want to name, that knew about this and like even sounded alarms about it, but it's just got killed, this story. So this Epstein thing is like another example. Jake pointed out to us that like a former Reddit CEO says she knew about Ghislaine, about this, and that like, again,
that everybody did.
Well, everybody. Yeah, that everybody.
Yeah, she's coming to the party, and in the 80s, it'd be like, well, you know who has cocaine, but with Ghislaine, it's like, well, she's the one you apply to if you want children.
Wow,
or something.
Yeah, shocking. So now she's got a husband, I guess. Is that the idea? And she's not telling anybody who it is.
Yeah, that she was secretly married. Wouldn't it just be to Jeffrey?
That's interesting. Jeffrey was unmarried, correct? I don't know this. I don't know actually whether
he seems that way.
Right. And there's a Netflix. There's a Netflix documentary about all this, by the way, during which I fell asleep. So if you want to watch it and not fall asleep, anybody who's out there listening, I would be interested to know what you discover. But I feel like if it's Jeffrey, well, I mean, I guess if it's Jeffrey, she would have reason not to let people know about that.
Yeah, and I don't know. Isn't it that you can plead some kind of, if you're married and your wife or husband commits a crime, you don't have to testify against them? Isn't there a law?
Yes, this is an excellent point. It's a very interesting theory. So like you basically saying this was a marriage of convenience so that they could plead the fifth.
At some point, and it depends on when they eloped. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, a while back everybody was talking about like legalizing polygamy and all of this stuff, and that just in general, conservatives tend to bemoan the breakdown of marriage as a meaningful institution. But one of the funny features of that is that all the privileges of marriage accrue to you, even if your marriage is a complete sham. Immigration privileges, and now, as you're pointing out, legal privileges, right? So she could well have just been kind of like, in some weird backhanded way, married to Epstein purely so that she could get this benefit out of it. I mean, not that people haven't always throughout all of history married for other reasons than the purity of their like passion for one another. But generally you assume that some form of like family building and procreation is the end of your marriage. And if that's not the case anymore, then people can just kind of like do whatever they want. I am amused by this New York Post article. Is this Ghislaine Maxwell's mystery husband? And I believe his name is Scott Borgerson, which is just great. It's so good.
Oh, yeah. Go on. They've actually, people have been openly.
Well, yeah. The Post printed this. Like, is this her husband? ... question mark. It's not actually ... question mark, but it practically is. It's a great article, and it's what I love is that his name is Scott Borgerson, which is literally like, you will be assimilated, which of course is what everybody talks about when they talk about these vast conspiracy theories, right? Is that there is some like huge impersonal network that's about to glom onto you. But no, who is he? He's a PhD or something. A British tech CEO, sorry. So not a PhD, but another 3-letter acronym. Signs suggest it could be a British tech CEO. Maxwell was most recently linked to divorced dad Scott Borgerson last year when she was reportedly living at his oceanfront mansion in Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts. But Borgerson denied the two were romantically involved in August. She was just happened to be living at his oceanfront mansion. And if you believe that, I've got an oceanfront bridge to tell you. But I don't know. I mean, I have no, I really like the marriage theory. I don't have anything as clever as that. But I think that more and more, I wonder how much of people's attitude about America and the world right now has in the background the sort of stunned realization that this Epstein thing actually is what we think it is, which is like a vast conspiracy lurking behind the wings of American life. And that Weinstein plus Epstein just kind of makes us feel, plus Ghislaine Maxwell, plus Scott Borgerson, plus the whole apparatus of it all is just making people feel as if it's all kind of a LARP. It's all kind of a fantasy matrix, and they just need to tear it down to get at the back. Again, you can be left or right. You can want the red pill, or you can want the woke sort of systemic critique. But whatever it is, you want to get past the thing that is hiding these deeper truths from you. I wonder how much of this is about that.
I think, and it's coming. These scandals follow fast on the heels of one another. This is a very compressed period of time to have these decades in the making universities come to life, right? So you have the most prolific serial rapist in American history, Bill Cosby, right? That was only a year or two ago.
Yeah.
You have Weinstein. I mean, these are massive, and these aren't people that acted just by themselves. You have R. Kelly, and then you have the kind of the media behind it, where their documentaries are made about these things, and it's just amazing. And we're bombarded with it.
Yeah.
So I think that it is. I think it starts to stick in one's head.
Yeah. Well, not feeling like you can rely upon your so-called trustworthy sources of media to give you trustworthy information compounds this tenfold, right? This idea that the people who are supposed to be the authorities on what's true and false are actually just complete shambles.
These are also, sorry, let me say one.
Yeah. No.
I always forget to make this point. Incidentally, the commonality that many of these people share is their activism in left-wing politics. Right?
Yeah, totally.
And so that's something that no wonder the media doesn't want to cover this. No wonder places like the New York Times will suppress stories about, say, Weinstein, a man who former President Barack Obama sent his daughter to intern with when she was in high school or college. I mean, these are people that are deeply, deeply connected in DNC politics.
Well, sorry, go on.
No, go on. Well, I always forget to make this point. Now, this is not to say that conservatives don't have their own scandals, but if you want to kind of peel back the cover on what's going on in our culture and some of the rot that's set in, you will find many a left-wing booster behind it.
Well, right. I mean, this is why it was so rich when the Me Too movement occasioned this grand retrospective and referendum on Bill Clinton's behavior in the White House, which was just completely to be excused at the time. But now that he's safely out of American political life and no longer somebody that we could hope to get a few more years of Democrat power out of, now we can get up on our high moral principles about re-examining, relitigating whether or not we actually can idolize him in the way, Bill Clinton is a skunk in this respect. And the Clintons in general are disgusting when it comes to their attitude towards women. But you can only get there with our media once they are no longer potentially going to be useful in positions of power. Until then, you're absolutely right, crickets. Jake just gave me the 5 minutes. We like, as always on the Roundtable, and especially now that it's just like you and me kind of hanging out, like, I said that I was going to throw news stories at you. I've thrown 2 at you, and we are basically at the end of our time. But I want to throw one more at you because this one is kind of delicious. Governor Walsh of Minneapolis made a FEMA request for aid, for disaster money to repair the damage of the 1619 riots, which is what we're calling these big kind of BLM protests turned looting turned riots. And he was like just totally smacked down. He was denied. Especially he did not get like 1.5 million, I think it is, that he asked for.
15 million.
Oh, 15 million. Geez, I'm misreading it here. $15 million in fire damage, which is just like, I don't know. I mean, I kind of like, here's what I feel bad about. I feel bad about the people because always this stuff, like the incompetence of mostly Democrats and the corruption of mostly Democrats gets the little guy like cheated basically. And that is, essentially the fact that this guy let thugs destroy small businesses and has now had this request denied means that like small businesses are the ones that are now just like destroyed and sitting in ruins. But there is, don't you agree, a certain poetic justice to like, no, it's not a natural disaster. It's something that you yourself permitted. I don't know. It's a mixed bag, but.
Yeah, I do hope that justice of another form visits the governor.
Right.
I hope he loses a re-election.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to enjoin people to camp out in front of the governor's mansion, till he leaves. But of course, that never happens, and it's always little people that get hurt.
Right, exactly. I mean, like,
it's difficult for me to talk about this in a level-headed way.
Right.
The other night, I was watching for I don't know how many days in a row now the violence in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
And I just can't. And watching what Portland's mayor was saying, and I look up his bio, which don't look up the bio of these people.
Yeah.
Tell our listeners, invariably if you want to talk about privilege, I mean, this guy went to the nicest private schools, and his father was a bigwig executive, and so they don't lose anything. Nothing, no harm is ever visited on their financial welfare, well-being of their loved ones. And I just can't, I don't know. So I would strongly urge people that don't vote these people into office.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you have the means, take your business and move. So all my fellow Californians, if you can do it, go to Texas.
Yeah. I mean, no, it is like, I would love to see people taking up GoFundMe's and stuff for this because like, I just keep coming back to, right. Like it's because honestly, like I don't trust this governor to distribute these funds well anyway. So like, even if even if he had the money approved, and that would have been like, there would have been the sort of slight consolation there that these small businesses were maybe going to get some relief, but like I doubt sincerely that money is not going into like other nefarious causes because, as you say, this guy is a total rat. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are taking the moving prospect much more seriously. I think people are all like, and rightly so, because if you make your city inhospitable to like law-abiding, respectable citizens, don't be surprised when those people leave. And I hope, as you say, I hope that those who have the means, and in fact, I hope that everybody does as much as possible. All right, Jake's telling me we're out of time. We gotta shut up here. But it's been a blast, man. It's been really fun. We don't get to like talk for extended periods of time.
I had all these great Roman tyrant jokes.
Oh, bummer.
Before we go, who's the guy that used to go swimming in the pool and have like young people bite his ankles? He called them his little minnows.
Oh, is this a Julio Claudian?
Is it Nero? I don't know. I was just thinking of.
It sounds like a Caligula or a Nero thing. It definitely sounds like a Nero thing, actually. But
I mean, as I say this, it sounds like a something that happens in modern day Hollywood, I suppose.
No, I'm sure I mean, there are all of these great. I mean, Tacitus has just like every possible amazing story about this stuff, but I just don't happen to know off the top of my head which one that was. Maybe one of our listeners. This is a call to our faithful listeners who have listened to the end of this show.
It's Suetonius. It's in Suetonius.
Is it in Suetonius? Okay, yeah. Somebody, some expert in Suetonius, please weigh in for us. Which emperor had his ankles bitten? All right, folks. It's been such a pleasure to do this kind of special edition of the Roundtable. If you would like to learn more, hear more of our content, please do visit our websites, americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewofbooks.com. Do not forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm going to shamelessly plug now that, Ryan is like a much more dignified man than I am, but I have no dignity. And so I'm going to shamelessly plug giving a 5-star review on iTunes to this podcast. It makes such a huge difference. And our listeners are awesome. We love engaging with them on Twitter and so forth. But
and our bosses, they beat us less severely.
Correct.
When 5-star ratings are given and when donations are given.
This whole podcast is going to incur for us a tremendous debt in physical punishment. And you, dear listener, can alleviate that debt by following and subscribing and rating. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We will talk to you next week. Just like, I remember when I lost my mind. That's great. And then we'll just have you and me just sing it. That's sweet. Okay.
I really hope that listeners believe that there's a statue of you have like a gold statue.
I can totally see that becoming a Twitter meme and people will Photoshop Brian into it.